Hello and welcome to our second episode of our video podcast, Adult Learning and Education in Times of COVID-19. My name is Barbara Hust from DVV International. In this podcast, we would like to give the floor to adult education experts and practitioners. During the next weeks, I will virtually travel around the world to speak with colleagues and partners on how the corona crisis affects our work and what we can do in these challenging times to provide our learning services to the community. By this means, we hope to stimulate new ideas and discussions in the adult education sector. Today, we are heading to Cape Town to talk to my colleague Farrell Hunter. He is Country Director of our DVV International Office in South Africa since 2010. Farrell has many years of experience in adult education. Prior to the position at DVV International, he was, among others, National Manager of a South African adult education NGO and Provincial Coordinator of a National Adult Education and Learning NGO. Welcome, Farrell.
Thanks very much, Barbara.
Farrell, to get an impression of the current situation in South Africa, could you share with us how the environment appears today and what differences you observe between today's environment and the one you saw before the corona crisis?
Yes. Well, I think like many parts of the world, there's certainly no freedom of movement anymore into public spaces by citizens other than essential service workers. And when people need to go out to replenish, food supplies. Other than that, the lockdown, meant that there was certainly no movement at all. The lockdown has been amended slightly in South Africa from what they call the level 5 total shutdown alert level to a level 4, which now means that some parts of the economy has been opened up and some level of movement by people is permitted for exercise purposes between 6 and 9 in the mornings. But certainly public spaces look a lot different to what they looked like before. I live just 2.5 kilometers from a very famous beachfront, and it is completely shut down. No one's allowed to go onto the beach, even with the opening up of spaces. People can be alongside the sandy bits, but they're not allowed to actually go in the water or spend time on the sand. Although the weather's getting cooler, maybe we're not too interested in going in the water right now.
If we look at civil society, so the field we are working in, we know civil society is an important actor in consolidating democracy in South Africa. Which role are civil society organizations in the field of adult learning and education playing in this current crisis?
Yeah. So, of course, our work in South Africa, as for many of our other country offices, is to support NGOs in the adult education sector. And we, of course, continue to do that under different circumstances demanding of us now. But also we are part of a broader coalition. It's called the People's Coalition on COVID-19, where NGOs across various sectors have come together to support each other, to consider what the state has put forward in terms of the lockdown, what it means for people from their living environments to their right to still access education, to health requirements, and particularly because large portions of our country live in very difficult circumstances in townships where social or physical distancing, as we prefer to call it, than social distancing, is very difficult. It's not unusual to find, 7, 10 people sometimes living in one very small space, no luxury of separate bedrooms or anything of the sort, where if any infection arises, then one could, separate from the family. So these are considerations that are very important for societies, particularly for poorer people, marginalized people that we work with, and for education, of course, as well. And our ability to continue practicing education is also, we needed to consider what that means, how we continue to do our education, so to speak, under these difficult times. So civil society, as I say, has come together to share with each other and to then put forward to a government what is called then a position on what it thinks and how it thinks government should engage, so that it is not just a one-way directive from government, but certainly opens up the space for us to engage with government as to what people from civil society feel about what this lockdown actually means for us.
Like many other sectors, the corona crisis is confronting adult education with many challenges, and addressing people with no access to digital devices or transferring education into the digital world, just to mention a few. What do you think? What can AIL providers learn from the current crisis in terms of their mission or their digital progress? What conclusion do you draw from the crisis at this point?
Yeah. Well, so firstly to say that our pedagogical education approach is not, does not rely rather a lot on technology. For us, it's often face-to-face educational approaches, seeing education as a social engagement as well, while, dealing with curriculum or what is, how learning translates to the social lived realities of people. These are not done in narrow technical systemic ways as often one sees in formal education. Community education adopts a very different approach. So of course the challenges to move in this times of distancing, physical distancing, to online approaches has demanded of us to rethink what our own approaches mean and how we can continue to do our educational work under these circumstances. So while, yes, we will, and we are planning to employ digital technologies and digital approaches, we're also looking at what people call multimodal approaches, which would include what is now known for us to consider as a social pedagogy. So in other words, it's not just about transferring a curriculum, but rethinking a curriculum to that addresses more so the social challenges, particularly at this time. The practical considerations, as you rightly raise, is of course at the level of the hardware. What kind of technologies do people have, or rather do they not have, would be the case for most of the poorer people in society, because they do not have the luxury of purchasing laptops and tablets and so forth that these applications could now be utilized for the sake of continuing learning. Data is another serious consideration where it is very expensive in South Africa, and how DVV can support our NGO partners, the communities in this respect, is how we've had to rethink our own plans and our own programs in terms of how we are going to engage and support for the continuation of community education.
I would now like to move up one level and look at the implications for society at large. The lockdown measures taken by almost all countries throughout the world are increasing the social divide between well-educated people and people from underprivileged educational backgrounds. So if you look at your region, how will this pandemic affect the most vulnerable groups in short and also in long term? I mean, you already touched upon the difficulties that DVV International is facing in addressing those people, but what does it mean on a societal level at large?
Yes. Well, people may know that, in fact, the societal challenges in South Africa are particularly great for the reason that we are the most unequal country in the world. And even when people talk about, a future new normal, we wonder what that is and how we have to almost co-construct and reconstruct a new way. I mean, this comes right from the top. I mean, the president himself mentioned that quite recently, that, we need to rethink what the future will look like. And I think many countries are saying this. The point for us, of course, is that these divides have come out and displayed itself much more clearly and starkly, in a way that it has shown us, how differently people live in different sides of the divide. But when a crisis like this hits us, everyone is compromised. So this thing that, the problem of poverty is the problem of the poor, I think that myth has now been shown to be false, because, poverty is while the divide, you can see physically, in reality, someone else's poverty is locked up in our existence. We cannot divide that. So I think in the case of South Africa, it certainly has questioned for us, if it hasn't done so before for many, and for many of us in our educational practice and in other ways, it's what we live. But I think that certainly this pandemic has woken those who have not yet been woken up to the fact that these realities need to be dealt with. The way in which countries exist, in their own spaces, but also globally, really needs to be reconsidered. The role for education, community education, public education, what people call citizen education, is crucially important. And organizations like DVV need to continue to engage in those spaces. We have the social, all these various development goals, sustainable development goals and the like. Many, I think, take those purely as, well, commitments that we may or may not reach. I think we need to go beyond even the written down commitments that sometimes are, circled, and say across all of them, how does education find its place? And how does education deal with the various issues, from poverty to unemployment, to social security, to a whole range of the issues addressed in those goals. But I think countries need to consider in the educational approaches, as we are asking here, is how are we going to change in the longer term so that we are better able to deal with crises like this sort, but the daily crisis of poverty, inequality, and the violence that is perpetuated through this, at a local level, but across the divide as well. So I think the future we are all yearning for is not completely crafted yet, but I think this certainly has raised a lot of questions for us to consider in trying to craft this new South Africa that, and a new world order, in fact, that we need to have. I think more and more people are realizing and speaking to this, across the spectrum of societies, rightly so too.
Well, many thanks, Farrell, for having shared your thoughts on the implications of the crisis for South Africa, what the new normal perhaps could mean, yes, and also what the adult education sector can learn from the current crisis. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks very much, Barbara, as well.
And if you want to further engage with us, we invite you to visit us on our website or contact us via email. Details will be displayed at the end. This was our second episode. We hope to see you next week for a third episode of Adult Learning and Education in Times of COVID-19. Stay healthy and goodbye. Goodbye, Farrell.
Thanks, Barbara. Stay safe.
You too.